Thanks for joining us. This is Ears to Hear, a podcast brought to you by the 25th Street Church of Christ in Columbus, Indiana. Check us out online at 25thstreetchurchofchrist.com for directions and meeting times. We appreciate you tuning in. Now, let's get into God's Word with Ears to Hear. Thanks for joining us on this week's podcast. As usual, my name is John Hines. I'm the preacher for the Church of Christ here in Columbus, Indiana, and my cohort here,
Andrew Walker.
Andrew, how are you doing today?
I am doing very well. It's good to see you, John.
Good to see you, Andrew. Today, this week, we're going to be thinking about drugs, and hate to sound like an after-school special of times gone by, but we wanted to talk about this issue. And I don't think it's a newsflash to anyone that we live in a pharmaceutical society. I don't know of another way of saying it. And when we, to think about drugs, well, there are good drugs and there are bad drugs. And people tend to draw that line there is black and white, and there's good and there's bad. And yet when you say, okay, well, which party is trying to make themselves feel better with drugs? Well, that's kind of what both parties are trying to do.
Right, I was about to say, you could say that's the point of any medication or drug.
Exactly. So you're medicating for some reason. So it's not exactly cut and dry there. But we live in a pharmaceutical society, and it starts going to issues. You're trying to medicate some problem. So I think part of this discussion that we're going to have is, at some point you need to get to the root of the problem, because whatever the drug is, usually it's just covering it up to one degree, from one degree to another. But anymore, a lot of kids are being medicated, and I think that's one thing, that it really is becoming a medication society. It's becoming culturally acceptable for kindergartners, first graders to be medicated. And you actually have schools and teachers who are dealing with behavioral issues at school, and you have parents who are being told, have you thought about maybe getting some medication, trying to deal with these behavioral issues? Whether that's the answer or not, that's another discussion. I'm just saying that's what's happening, that you have kids who are growing up on drugs.
Right. Yeah, it is a pretty complicated topic, because there are, I think, legitimate cases of disease,
Right.
and
Sure.
that are treatable through medication. So we certainly don't want to say that
No.
any medication should be
No.
refused.
No.
And I don't think you were trying to make that point.
No, if someone's on asthma, they need asthma. If someone has asthma, they need asthma medication.
Sure.
If, things like that.
Sure. And then another thing that really this discussion bleeds into is also the topic of addiction, because most of the time, once we start talking about drugs and problems with drugs in society, a lot of it comes from addictive drugs and the toll that takes on society and on people's lives.
Yeah, very much so. So in discussing drugs, we're kind of going to go through it and kind of take, I'll go through the traditional view, I guess, a little bit, and then we'll try to look at it in a little more detail. But whenever we talk about drugs, and whenever people ask me about certain things, one of the first questions is, okay, is it legal? And I know what the legality of it, frankly, it doesn't matter to a lot of people. For example, in schools, when you have teenagers who are literally selling Adderall or Ritalin, they have their medications and they have prescriptions for them, or whatever the case may be, and they're selling them. They're selling them on social media.
Yep.
And they just see it as, it's just an Adderall. It's just something to get you through the day.
Yeah.
They don't see it as dealing drugs.
Yeah, you mentioned even culture. I think there's a growing culture now of just flippancy toward the laws around. You think of pot culture or marijuana culture. Fashion, clothing, it all revolves around this culture, and no one kind of really blinks an eye anymore at the law in that regard. A lot of states are just at this point now saying, okay, we're just going to undo the laws then, because no one's really observing them anyway. But yeah, I think the legality may be one of the weakest things that a lot of people think about when it comes to controlling their behavior.
Yeah.
For some people, maybe
Right.
that's enough to keep them from doing something. If it's illegal, I won't. I would otherwise. I really doubt most people are taking the law into most account when it comes to these issues, though.
Probably not. They should. And I hope as Christians we take it seriously when the Bible says to submit to governing authorities.
Yeah, absolutely.
We don't want to bring shame upon ourselves. We don't want to bring shame on the church. We don't, frankly, want the government to interfere in our lives as much as possible. We pay taxes and we're trying to live quiet and peaceably, and we have the passage about submitting to authority. So that's just a quick, is it legal? That's one hurdle that has to be gotten over.
Yeah, it is a piece of it.
Another question is it addictive? And we'll get into this into more detail, but it brings up issues of self-control. And like I said, we'll talk more about that. But in 1 Corinthians chapter 6, when Paul says something may be lawful, but he says, I'm not going to be brought under the power of it. And as far as who we are brought under the power of, it better be the Lord. If it's something else, and it doesn't matter what it is, because I think that's one of the things about this that we're going to talk about, that anything can be addictive. Anything can be elevated to that level. So is it addictive? That brings up issues of self-control. Another question that I ask pretty often, or that I think we need to think about is the drug, whatever it is, or it doesn't have to be a drug, is it concealing an issue?
Mm-hmm.
And to think about things that people do that cover up issues like anxiety, or issues like depression, or issues like anger, or issues like whatever, fill in the blank. If something is just masking those problems, well, then it's just masking those problems. They're still there.
Yeah.
And chances are they're going to come to the surface at some point.
Yep.
Because you haven't really dealt with the issues. So if someone has an issue with depression, they need to get to the root of that depression. Now, I understand there may be literally some chemical imbalances and problems and things like that, and they may need medication to deal with that, and that's fine.
It is part of why it's such a pervasive issue and why it's so difficult to get out of, because it is both physically something that you become either dependent or feel the need for, but mentally too, psychologically, like you said, if it's pushing away the pain of something else,
right,
or it's masking another problem so that you don't feel it for a while, that is such a strong draw for so many people to. People who feel so much pain in their lives from all kinds of problems and troubles, it's incredibly enticing to have to feel nothing instead.
Yeah, it's escapism. And I think everybody at some point dealing with issues wants to escape. So it's real easy to point at people who go down this path and say, and just wag your head. We all deal with issues like these, whatever the case may be. Another thing, is it conforming? And I think sometimes people do things, or at least perhaps they initially do things, because they are conforming to the world. They're conforming to friends. They hang out with three or four other people. They're all doing whatever it is, and they're like, oh, they're going to do it too. Mm-hmm. And so they conform themselves to that.
Yeah.
So one of the issues is, are we conforming ourselves to the world, or are we living transformed lives?
It's a topic of celebrity and people who are influential. The culture now is, it's cool to have done drugs, or it's cool to be part of kind of the lifestyle or the culture of it. I already said about the fashion industry, and there's so many musicians or entertainers who so much of their persona is kind of, you know, based around their use of drugs or their history with drugs. So yeah, it's a big pervasive part of culture.
Yep, very much so. So that's another issue. And we know what Romans says, that we're transformed by the renewing of our minds. And that goes, I think one of the issues in this discussion is you always have to replace something.
Mm-hmm.
And it's one thing, you know, in thinking about this, we hate to sound like a certain president's wife from the early 80s. It's real easy to say, just say no. But when you look at Scripture, and it's the demon in the house, right? And it leaves, the house is swept. He comes back, he finds the house vacant, and he brings 7 other demons. And the ending is worse. It's one thing to say no. Okay, what are you going to replace it with? You know, it's one thing to lay aside the wickedness, you know, James chapter 1, lay aside wickedness and all those things, and receive with meekness the implanted word. Mm-hmm. You have to do both. It's not enough to just say, don't do this. What are you going to replace it with?
Right.
So when people go down this road and it's, oh, well, don't do this, don't do that, don't do these, don't do those. Okay, what am I supposed to do then? And that's where be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Receive with meekness the implanted word. Start going down a different path. So that's transformational living.
Right.
Another issue that comes up with things like this is, do I try to hide it? And I think that's a big telltale sign. If you try to hide something from, maybe it's parents, maybe it's, you know, other family, maybe it's members of the church, whatever it is. If you are trying to hide something, then you know on some level you should not be doing it. Otherwise, you would not try to hide it. So those are some issues. Some of the, you know, I remember talking to a young fellow one time, and we were talking about marijuana, and his excuse, and he was for it. His argument was God created it. The simple way, and I mean, it's just a common argument that people try to use, that it's a natural substance. So, you know, it's like the grocery store. Organic butter is better than GMO butter, and you know, it's organic. So, and I just took him back to Genesis and talked about how God created all these things, and God created the trees of the field, and it says He created some things good for food, and some things were beautiful to look at. It looks like He created a pine tree. That doesn't mean you have to go out and smoke a pine cone.
Well, you can go further than that. He created the tree of the knowledge of good and evil that He then told Adam and Eve they were not to partake of.
Right.
You know, someone could say, why would God create the very thing that would be a temptation to his created followers? You know, why would He allow that to be in the garden with them? So just because something exists in God's creation is not necessarily God's endorsement of it.
Yeah, that's certainly one case, one instance of just because He made it does not mean that you should eat it.
Right.
So anyway, those are just some of the common issues, and that's kind of the standard way of answering things.
Yeah.
Andrew, how else? What else do we need to consider in this discussion?
Well, you know, as I was attacking this issue and kind of thinking about it, I first kind of wanted to start by thinking of what are some of the motivators, what are some of the underlying reasons that people might turn to addictive behavior. But as I was thinking about that, I also thought, you know, sometimes we really address this very sternly sometimes, and I think it's especially hard for Christians who maybe have never dealt with issues of addiction. And you know, I think sometimes you mentioned a bit, but we tend to separate drug addiction and other addictive-like behaviors. You know, we often will cast a much softer visage on, you know, addiction to food or addiction to sex or addiction to other behaviors, you know, things that maybe we don't look at the same way as being drug addicted. And probably because, you know, going to a buffet isn't illegal in our society, but buying Coke is. So
we're into like social stigmas.
Right. There's I think a stigma about addiction to substances, especially.
And it doesn't mean that gluttony is right.
Right, absolutely.
It's just socially accepted.
There's not a gradient of sins that are more sinful than others. We just tend to cast a more negative eye on these kind of sins. And it is something to realize too, that it's a real problem that affects members of the church. It affects people who are part of God's family. I mean, it's a growing thing, and it's a thing that a lot of people do hide. So it is something to be aware of. And I think the other piece too I wanted to bring out a bit was just the way we think of it. It's not just that, oh, these people have no self-control. They're just immature. They're just making bad decisions. They're not going to change. I mean, we need to realize that this is addiction is a disease of uncontrollable behavior. It's an issue of being so ingrained into needing something that it's unmanageable for the person. I mean, that's the very thing by which we can call it an addiction, really, is if the person is not able to manage their behavior or able to control their behavior because of their dependency on something. And I think one of the steps we have to take is to admit when we're not in control of ourselves and admit when something else is controlling us. I mean, we have to be able to do that first before we can ever start improving. One of the common traits of addicts is they think they can quit whenever they want, and they think that they're in control. And as long as they think they're in control, they're not going to change their behavior. So anyway, it's just some things I wanted to bring out. But anyway, I also wanted to look at kind of why addictions come about, why people might turn to these kind of things. And you brought up the idea of escaping or trying to cover something up, and I think that's such a big part of it. We as people we're uncomfortable with voids. We're uncomfortable with there being any feeling of something lacking or feeling inadequate, and so it's very tempting to want to flee from that. I actually thought of the example, and it doesn't have anything to do with drugs, but in 1 Kings chapter 19, Elijah fled because he was afraid. He fled from his fears, even though he feared God and he was obedient to God, and he had success in his life following God and doing what God had told him to do as his prophet. I mean, he had just finished defeating the prophets of Baal, and he prayed for rain to return. So he was being successful, but he was afraid when he felt like no one was helping him, and he was alone against the efforts of Ahab and Jezebel. So he ran. Not to say that he turned to addiction, but I think the principle is there that sometimes even people who fear God want to run, and they want to flee to somewhere where they don't have to feel the pain or the fears that they feel.
Yeah, I was just looking for the passage in Proverbs when it talks about strong drink. And it, that whole account ends with basically the individual, they have struck me, but I was not hurt. They have beat me, but I did not feel it. When shall I awake that I may seek another drink? And here's a person who it is self-destruction, mm-hmm. is what it is, but it's a vicious cycle. And I know that sounds cliche, but that's what it is. But it is escapism. It is trying to, and I think that's one of that was my point, that there are real issues here. And I think that's one reason that it really makes me uncomfortable when you hear about children being medicated. Because here are children whose brains are literally developing. And they're going to continue to develop for a couple decades. And they are developing in a pool of medications. And it just makes you wonder if you have a lot of children who are not learning how to cope with life, mm-hmm. because they've never done it. They've always had medical restraint, frankly.
Yeah. I just was reminded of something, talking about this idea of kind of fleeing or running from, responsibility, or running from developing. I actually watched a video a couple of days ago. It was a guy he has a channel on YouTube where he actually talks to people on the streets of Detroit, and he'll bring clothes and give them to them, but he'll interview people as well that he talks to and that he helps. And he interviewed this woman who had been homeless in Detroit for I I think she said like 12 or 14 years or something. Started when she was about 17 and, was in her early 30s when he talked to her. And it was a really interesting, it was just, I mean, for one, it was a heartbreaking video to watch, but it was also just really, she was incredibly frank and she was incredibly blatant about her answers and very, very truthful. And he asked her just outright, he's like, why, you've tried to get clean before, what would bring you back to this? What would bring you back to this place? And her answer outright was just, out there, there's responsibility. And if I live here, then I don't have those responsibilities here. And she was completely honest, just saying that, she didn't want to face the responsibility that existed in regular life. She preferred the simplicity of the life that she saw herself having there. It was just a really eye-opening thing, I think, to see someone so honestly just say, yeah, I just want to avoid taking on that responsibility. They just didn't feel capable at that point to do that.
Yeah. I think that makes a pretty good segue into Romans chapter 6.
Mm-hmm.
And you have the whole discussion as the chapter starts off with Paul saying, "What shall we say then? Shall we continue to sin that grace may abound? Certainly not." Later on, verse 15, "Shall we sin because we are not under the law but under grace? Certainly not. Do you not know that to whom you present yourselves slaves to obey, you are that one slaves whom you obey, whether of sin leading to death or of obedience leading to righteousness?" That idea of, verse 20, "For when you were slaves of sin, you were free in regard to righteousness. What fruit did you have then in the things of which you are now ashamed?" He says, I'm speaking in human terms because the Romans were having a lot of difficulty with it. But he's using this idea of either way you're a slave.
Mm-hmm.
You're either a slave of righteousness or you're a slave to sin. Now here's this lady you're talking about on this video, and she saw her lifestyle as simple. She saw her life as the better of two choices. And because frankly the devil is deceiving. Here's an individual who has been deceived into thinking she's making the right choice, and she doesn't realize she is a slave of that choice. And it's just it is heartbreaking when you see people who they are deceived and they think this is the answer.
Right.
It's not the answer. The Lord is the answer. Anyway, go ahead.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that was one of the other points I was going to make as far as why do we see addictive behaviors be so prevalent. And it's the other part too is that once on that path, there's you build up a tolerance to things to where you become more and more deeply ingrained in the path that you choose. And so I think that idea in Romans 6, in verse 12 through 14, it talks about letting sin reign in your mortal body. It's for one, it's letting that be the thing that controls you. And the more you give yourself over to that, the next part of verse 12, he says to make you obey its passions. It's a cumulative effect that becomes stronger the longer you're in it. And that's true both from a chemical perspective, from a medical perspective, but I think too from a behavioral perspective. The more we get familiar, whether our choices are sinful or whether we live a lifestyle where we're conscious of what God wants for us and we're trying to make those decisions, the longer we park in either of those camps, the more comfortable we'll get in those situations.
Very much so. I have a question for you, Andrew. If someone, and we'll just pick one and maybe more than one. Okay, if anxiety is an issue, we'll choose anger. If anger is an issue, let's say John here has anger issues. Okay, what do I need to do? Because what you just talked about, the more I let it fester, the more of a problem it's going to be.
Mm-hmm.
And it'll consume me. Okay, so if I have anger issues and they're starting to, I start to recognize them, what sort of things do I need to do? Or how can I deal with the issue?
Yeah.
If I have anger issues.
Well, I think for any issue, we first have to trace it back to what is the thing that gets me started down this path? What is the thing that sets me off? What is the thing that I know in the case of anger? What's the thing that I know really gets me going?
Okay, so we'll pause right there because the pronouns you used are what.
I.
And when it comes to anger, it's usually who, right?
Yeah, we like to.
You're angry at someone. Okay,
Right.
so someone is causing you to have anger issues. Now, what do I need to do?
So then it's a matter of, well, I guess the way I look at it, Jesus said, do not murder. I say to you, don't be angry. He didn't say don't let other people make you angry, or don't stop other people from doing the things that make you angry. The command is to you. The command is to the one who has control over their actions and their response. Right. So it comes down to the person being angry. You have to ask yourself, what has my reaction been? What am I in control of? And what should my reaction be?
In that context, there in the Sermon on the Mount, that's verse 22, Matthew 5, verse 22. I say to you, whoever is angry with his brother without a cause shall be in danger. Actually, it's verse 21 is the one you mentioned. You've heard it said to those of old, you shall not murder. Whoever murders will be in danger of judgment. Verse 23 is, if you bring your gift to the altar and there remember that your brother has something against you, go to him. Leave your gift at the altar and go to him.
Mm-hmm.
And the point that I'm wanting to make is, okay, if you recognize you have this problem, a lot of times the reason that it festers is because there's no communication. You're not going to the individual.
Right.
And I think this is what it gets to, whether we're talking about anger, whether we're talking about anxiety, whether we're talking about depression. It's usually because of the relationships in your life, whether it's you're young or whether you're married, whether it's in the church, it's relationships.
Mm-hmm.
And relationships start to break down, and people think that you got to talk at some point. You have to communicate. You have to go to the person. You have to work on that relationship. And that's my point, that if you don't do that, if communication breaks down and it festers and it festers and it festers, and this is how life works. And I don't know if it's because society is becoming, as much as we talk about social media, but people are starting to not know how to communicate.
Mm-hmm.
We're getting to a point where it's like, how dare you call me on my phone when you could have just texted me 3 words? And we're actually limiting communication. And then when we do communicate through text, it's not as good a way of communication as speaking, because you don't get emotion, you don't get inflection, you don't get all these things that communication requires. And anyway, it breaks down. Anyway, my point is, we try to slap a Band-Aid on with a pill to deal with anxiety,
mm-hmm.
to deal with whatever it is that involves someone else.
Right. And I would say, too, so much of turning to things to try to deaden those feelings or try to replace it with addictions, it's us trying to maybe attack the symptoms of those feelings we don't like, but we're not addressing the root cause of what is giving us those problems, what is making us feel those emotions, and that's the thing that we need to address. That's what Jesus is talking about when he says go to them.
Right.
Go to the root cause of the problem between you and the other person.
Yeah. I was thinking along those same lines, Philippians chapter 4, when you have these 2 individuals, Euodia and Syntyche, however you pronounce her name, who are they're having trouble. They're at odds with one another. And just real quickly, he says, be anxious for nothing, but he says, whatever things are true, whatever things are noble, meditate on those good things. But at the same time, he tells the recipient of this letter, verse 3, I urge you also, true companion, help these women. So the recipient of this letter here in Philippi, he was to help these women get along. Now that sounds a whole lot like, to just be frank about it, it sounds like a mediator, certainly, but it also sounds a little bit like therapy.
Mm-hmm.
And what is therapy but talking? Talk it out. Communicate. Get it out there so that you can deal with it rather than slapping, rather than putting a Band-Aid on it. It doesn't heal on its own. You may mask it. You may mask it for a long time, but it's probably still going to be there.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think too, just to say for anyone who's, trying to come out of this kind of issue, trying to overcome maybe an issue they've struggled with in this area. One of the verses I had looked at was James chapter 1 in verse 12. He says, "Blessed is the man who remains steadfast under trial, for when he has stood the test," in other words, when we make good decisions, even if they're small, even if they're incremental victories, when he stood the test, he will receive the crown of life, which God has promised to those who love him. Let no one say when he is tempted, I am being tempted by God, for God cannot be tempted with evil, and he himself tempts no one. But each person is tempted when they are lured and enticed by his own desire. So I think two things there. One is, for one, we ought not to look for people to blame or look for other sources to blame.
You got to own it.
There is a need for personal responsibility in starting to try to find what is the root cause of my problem that I'm trying to cover up.
Even here, it's like you don't get to say God did it. You don't even really get to say the devil did it. You're drawn away by your own desires.
Right.
Own it.
Right. And then the other two, which is I think the first part of this verse, which is overcoming by being steadfast under trials.
Right.
Like we said, it's a matter of getting acclimated to whichever state you're in. You get acclimated to your addictions, or you begin to get acclimated to a pattern of making decisions to do better. So it's not a thing where someone repents or they turn to the Lord and they
one and done,
their sins are cleansed, and then they never have any temptations for those substances again. It doesn't work that way.
Each day has enough troubles of its own.
Absolutely. And it's going to be something that is going to take constant diligence to be aware of and to look out for.
And to that point, it's like, take each day at a time.
Mm-hmm.
And each day, God makes the way of escape. Now, you got to take it, and that's where personal responsibility comes into it again. But God does make the way of escape. But don't think tomorrow, next week, next year. Each day has enough worries of its own.
Yep. And then as we do that, just like you said, anything we try to do in a vacuum by ourselves is going to be so much more difficult.
Right.
Talking to other people, letting other people know what our problems are. The Bible says, bear one another's burdens. That's exactly what that's about. It's share that difficulty with other people who can help you and who can know what you're going through.
We live in such an independent society where it's I'm on my own and I'm independent to a fault.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the exact opposite of what the church is.
Yeah.
The church is to be lift up the hands that hang down. Like I said, bear one another's burdens. Supplying what each other needs.
And the thing we started with too, people are so afraid to do that because there has been a lot of stigma before.
Right.
So for those of us who maybe haven't experienced that, maybe we find it harder to empathize with that, we really need to make the effort to be open to hearing from people and make ourselves approachable. If we're someone who talks down or gets all preachy about the subject,
hey,
present company excluded,
Thank you.
then yeah, it's going to be hard for people to want to approach us.
Yeah, very much so. And if we are standoffish, now, I mean, you tell the truth in love. People have to take responsibility, but we're here for one another. We're trying to help one another. And I'll say this, and this goes back to one of the first things you said. This is a real problem in the church, and it's not always in the form of pills. We're talking about addiction is kind of what we're talking about. We're talking about dealing with pain.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I'm not sure if I know anybody who's not trying to deal with pain. That is common. It is common to all. So if we look down our nose at someone, we better understand we ourselves are probably dealing with some of these same issues. And we ourselves are probably using some sort of Band-Aid that we should not be using. Rather than, the tail end of James, since we left off there in James, confess your trespasses to one another and pray for one another that ye may be healed.
Mm-hmm.
that's a wonderful thing, and that's what we need to do. So anyway, good discussion. Hope this was beneficial for those tuning in. Andrew, hope you have a good remainder of the week, dude.
Yep. Thanks, John. Hope you do too.
Yep. Appreciate everyone tuning in. Appreciate you having ears to hear. Have a good week, and we hope you tune in next week. Thanks for being with us.